On our broadcast tonight, the plot thickens in that alleged terrorist plot to attack Americans. The key figure now accused of trying to make bombs out of ordinary beauty supplies. A mystery in the National Forest. A census worker found hanging from a tree with a three-letter word scrawled on his chest. Center stage, this city, Pittsburgh, practically shuts down to host the world. Tonight, we've already seen the first clash with police. And on the way here, President Obama wins a big one in his effort to change the way the world sees the U.S. Plus, the transformation of this city from steel gray all the way to green. Nightly News begins now.
This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
And good evening from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, one of the great American cities. But unfortunately for the people who live and work here, it has been virtually emptied out so that Pittsburgh can host the G20 summit of leaders from around the world. The downtown section of this city is desolate. No people, not a car or truck or bus or a boat or a plane overhead. Just police, troops with Humvees and automatic weapons watching over empty streets. This is big event security in our post 9/11 age, which is actually where we begin tonight with this plot the feds believe they have broken up, designed to attack Americans the way we have seen attacks carried out overseas. So before we get to this gathering, we're going to begin tonight with our justice correspondent Pete Williams in Washington. Pete, good evening.
Brian, that Denver area man arrested last week is now accused of terrorism, planning to use bombs for some kind of attack in New York. And prosecutors say he was trying to master a formula for making a powerful explosive. As he was brought to a hearing in federal court in Denver today, Najibullah Zazi faced serious new charges of planning to use bombs, which carry a maximum sentence of life in prison. In July and August, prosecutors say Zazi and at least 3 others, so far unnamed, shopped at Denver area beauty product suppliers buying gallons of chemicals that can be combined to make the same kind of explosive that was used in the deadly 2005 bus and subway bombings in London.
He had objectives of where he wanted to try and conduct attacks that were far further along in terms of their planning than I think people thought just a little while ago.
3 times in late August and early September, the government says, Zazi got a hotel room in suburban Denver, one that had a stove in it, and heated some of the chemicals to concentrate them. Court documents say he struggled with the formula, repeatedly contacting someone else for guidance, seeking to correct the mixture to make explosives. Just before heading to New York 2 weeks ago, prosecutors say he searched the internet for stores there that sold similar chemicals.
We have an individual who was trained in bomb making by Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. He came back here, he had co-conspirators, and he was working on getting that bomb ready to go.
But federal officials tell NBC News they do not believe Zazi ever actually succeeded in making explosives from the formula before he was arrested. Also today, a judge in Denver ordered Zazi's father, accused of lying to FBI agents, released on bail.
Thank you so much.
And in Brooklyn, an Islamic cleric, also charged with lying to agents, was ordered released as well. And in a completely separate case, the FBI today arrested an Illinois man accusing him of planning to drive a car bomb to a federal building in Springfield. He thought he had help from an Al-Qaeda operative, but that person turned out to be an FBI undercover officer, and no actual bomb was involved, Brian.
Before all the leaders arrived here, and while there are far fewer protesters than there are members of law enforcement and the military, it is a tense evening here in Pittsburgh. All the people in the downtown buildings here, big companies like Alcoa and Mellon Bank, were told not to bother coming to work today. Our own Mike Taibbi has been out in it all day long. Mike, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. You know, the protesters have been talking about crashing the G20 party. And here on the route to that party, there have been some tense moments, as you say, in at least 3 arrests, but nothing resembling an actual collision.
This is
You must leave.
Police fired pepper spray canisters for crowd control when some in the group of several hundred protesters they'd initially allowed to march downtown without a permit stopped following police instructions. There were no reported injuries or significant confrontations.
Raise your right hands.
The city was ready. With the addition of around 1,000 out-of-town police officers sworn in for temporary duty, the total law enforcement contingent of more than 4,000 uniforms, including Pennsylvania National Guard troops, seemed to far outnumber the protesters. Elsewhere in a town that seemed all but paralyzed, there was football. The streets and downtown access points and the shops and businesses that chose to stay open were that empty.
Usually there's people walking around, vendors. No one come down. It's like a ghost town down here today.
Many businesses did close, some covering their windows with plywood over worries about vandalism. There's been a bit of that so far, windows smashed at a bank branch, but the main complaint in the shopping and business districts has been the absence of customers in the city's unprecedented security lockdown. As for the protesters, some gathered in impromptu tent cities that were a mess in the intermittent rain. Many said they're here to make a nonviolent statement and for the experience.
Even though it's raining, it feels good because everybody's very welcome and open, and the rain might be cold, but the people are warm.
So far, this city's hopes and even prayers for basically an uneventful gathering have been answered. Key word there, so far. It of course can turn south in just a minute. One law enforcement source told me today there may only be 1,000 to 2,000 protesters in town, but the plan was and still is to be ready for the worst. Brian?
Mike Taibbi out on the streets of this city. Mike, thanks. And now we turn to the business of this gathering. When we talk about the global recession, that gives you some idea of the atmosphere here. And this host president of this summit, Obama of the United States, comes in here following two speeches that now change U.S. foreign policy. Our White House correspondent Savannah Guthrie is with us here in Pittsburgh, along with the protesters. Savannah, good evening.
We've got company. Well, Brian, right on the heels of the UN, world leaders are here looking for initiative from the president on the global financial crisis. And with this frantic pace, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that, as you said, in 24 hours, two big speeches changing U.S. foreign policy.
How are you?
Playing host to the world, the president and first lady arrived in Pittsburgh this evening for the G20 Economic Summit. In a week of high-stakes summitry, the president, taking a break from the domestic policy fights that dominated the summer, is carving out a sweeping new foreign policy vision.
We have sought, in word and deed, a new era of engagement with the world.
Today, chairing a rare summit-level meeting of the UN Security Council, a first for an American president.
The draft resolution has been adopted unanimously.
Mr. Obama won unanimous support for a resolution to work toward nuclear disarmament, looking to give the issue high-profile emphasis as concerns about North Korea and Iran mount.
We must demonstrate that international law is not an empty promise and that treaties will be enforced.
It demonstrated a sea change in U.S. foreign policy based on a calculation that the administration has made that it's a lot better to work within international institutions than it is simply, as the administration has been saying, to carp from the sidelines.
Now it's the global financial crisis on the agenda. Since G20 leaders last met in London, the economy has entered a fragile recovery. But that has created a new set of pressures on the president. The world looking for leadership on tough new reforms of the financial system, so a crisis many think was made in the USA won't happen again. And seeking an exit strategy from the extraordinary government measures used to stave off a depression.
He's got to create the sense that there is a plan for economic stability and recovery. And not only is it going to be big, fancy words and summit statements, but real action to follow up on this in the months ahead.
And the work of the summit begins tomorrow. And of course, world leaders watch the president's domestic battles also very closely. To the extent he's embroiled in a healthcare fight, that affects whether he can get things done that they care about, financial regulation, climate change, that kind of thing, Brian.
Savannah Guthrie here covering the president. Because the president's here, our whole team is here. Chuck Todd, our political director and chief White House correspondent as well. Chuck, very simple question. Why Pittsburgh for this gathering?
Well, this is about, frankly, you hate to say it, but it's about domestic politics in some ways. This Obama White House wants to highlight industrial cities that are showing a turnaround. So it's about showing off some economic policy. and of what's going on here. And Pittsburgh is a city they want to showcase, but it doesn't hurt politically. Western Pennsylvania, parts of industrial Ohio, parts of industrial Indiana, very important for the president politically in 2010, 2012. So being seen, sort of all politics is local, they love the fact that the president is dominating the local coverage and the local media.
Chuck Todd, Savannah Guthrie, the team is all here covering politics at this G20 summit. Thanks to you both. In political news from back east, the U.S. Senate is back to 100 members. Massachusetts has a new interim senator. The seat vacated by the death of Senator Ted Kennedy has now been filled by a longtime Kennedy aide and friend, Paul Kirk. The former head of the Democratic Party happens to be the executor of Ted Kennedy's will. He was appointed by the governor of Massachusetts today only to serve until January, when a special election can be held. Kirk said today he will not run for the seat and will only hold on to it for that interim basis. He restores now the 60-vote majority for the Democrats. A disturbing story to report tonight from Kentucky. Federal officials are investigating the death of a census worker. It's been reported he was found hanging from a tree with the word Fed, F-E-D, scrawled on his chest. Our own Ron Mott is live tonight outside State Police Headquarters in London, Kentucky. Ron, good evening.
Brian, good evening to you. The cause of death has been ruled asphyxiation, but authorities are not yet ready to classify the death, saying it could be one of three things: an accident, a suicide, or murder. The body of 51-year-old census worker Bill Sparkman was discovered September 12th. Sparkman moved to this area back in the 90s to work for the Boy Scouts of America. Friends say he was looking to get a full-time teaching position when he died. Brian?
Ron Mott on the story in Kentucky tonight. Ron, thanks. When we continue from Pittsburgh on a Thursday night, what was that revolutionary medical and science breakthrough that millions of Americans woke up to this morning? And whatever happened to the smokestacks and warehouses that used to be here? The big city that has slowly turned green.
Sunday, 2 exclusive interviews. Former President Bill Clinton on the challenges facing America, and New York Governor David Paterson on his relationship with the Obama administration. If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press with David Gregory.
Weekday mornings, America's political conversation starts here. Join Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski at the table. Morning Joe, weekday mornings on MSNBC, the place for politics.
We are back now from Pittsburgh with a story a lot of people heard about first thing this morning. It's being touted as a very important step, a first, in what has been a futile search for a vaccine against AIDS. This latest news comes from Thailand, where an experimental vaccine had results that surprised even the experts working on it. Our report tonight from our chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell.
We are now one step closer to finding an HIV vaccine.
The results of the clinical trial in Thailand are positive, but on a very small scale. Those who got the experimental vaccine had 31% fewer HIV infections. Still, it is the closest thing to a success after 25 years of AIDS vaccine research.
This is progress, but not by any means the final answer. It's an important step forward, but it should not be interpreted that we now have a vaccine.
Many of us expected. Whether the bang for the buck was worth it is still something we have to find out.
Years of research will be needed to use the clues from this study to try to develop a vaccine that would protect far more people. Despite the challenges, scientists agree that a vaccine represents the best hope of stopping the AIDS plague that still kills millions a year. As for another vaccine, swine flu, which will be coming soon, the U.S. will eventually have plenty. But today, the World Health Organization announced that the global supply will be 3 billion doses, 2 billion less than hoped for. Brian?
Bob Bazell back at our studios in New York. Bob, thanks. Back here in Pittsburgh, summit just getting underway. Protests continue. We look at Wall Street, a second losing session in a row. The Dow finished the day down just over 41 points. When we come back, how many people really love baseball and can't live without it? We might have found the answer here earlier today.
Tomorrow on Today, Meredith sits down with the man Michael Jackson trusted with his most painful childhood memories.
He was very physical. Throw you and hit you hard as he can.
Only on Today on NBC.
NBC News, honored with 5 Emmy Awards, including Outstanding Live Coverage of America's Historic Election Night, and 3 Emmys for NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams. Most watched, most honored. NBC News.
Back here in Pittsburgh, we were talking earlier in the broadcast about how, with the exception of our one protester here, the people have been emptied out of this city because of the crushing security for this summit. Right behind us, they actually had a baseball game today, and about 3,000 hardy souls walked past the Humvees and the automatic weapons downtown. They got searched at the turnstiles, and they actually saw the Pittsburgh Pirates lose to the Cincinnati Reds. The Pirates shut down the upper deck of the stadium for the first time in the history of the franchise. Too few people. They upgraded all the fans there today to those cushy club-level seats close to the field as a thank you for putting up with a city that's been effectively shut down. Before they gathered here in Pittsburgh, in fact, as late as this afternoon, world leaders were gathered in New York at the UN. This was President Obama's first time as host of that gathering, and so this morning's Security Council meeting at the outset had the feel of a high school reunion. Lots of schmoozing and handshaking. There was an interesting moment when his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, grabbed the chair right behind the president, only to be later gently reminded that chair belonged to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And everybody there was still talking about last night's speech by Iran's President Ahmadinejad to a largely empty General Assembly hall because so many delegations walked out either before or during the speech. Then there was the now famous rambling 90-minute rant by Muammar Gaddafi. The photo of the colonel's cluttered lectern made the front page of today's New York Times. His marathon speech even prompted Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez to promise today to keep his own speech short, down to the tiny notebook he used for it. As he put it, quote, Gaddafi has said everything there is to say. When we come back from Pittsburgh, when the whole world changed around them, they figured they had to change starting in their own backyard. We are back tonight from Pittsburgh, though if you haven't been here in a while, you might not recognize the place. This, by the way, is the first couple wiping a light rain off each other at a conservatory, a residential location for the first event tonight. Again, light precipitation falling, nothing to ruin the summit. They once made about half of all the steel in this country, in this city. Big, heavy industry. Factories, smoke, and smokestacks. It was the work that built this city. But when a lot of that went away, the city decided to go another way. We have that story from our chief environmental affairs correspondent, Ann Thompson.
Clean and green are usually not the first words the world associates with Pittsburgh. Its image forged in the smoky, gritty business of steel. One writer described Pittsburgh as hell with the lid off. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright said it should be abandoned. Not anymore. Once synonymous with pollution, today NBC News, Pittsburgh.
And that's our broadcast for this Thursday night. Thank you for being with us. On behalf of our protester here with the Bullhorn, I'm Brian Williams reporting tonight from Pittsburgh. We hope to see you tomorrow evening back home in New York. Good night.